Warning, collision imminent in 10 minutes. Warning, anomaly detected in elevator shaft.
Today we are exploring how to do Previz in Unreal Engine 5. And I'm not gonna lie, the opening cinematic you just saw really got out of hand. I was not expecting it to be that in-depth or that advanced, but it is a great example of how much is at your disposal in this program. And today we're gonna do a few things. We're gonna first define what Previz and TechViz are. Then we're gonna hop into Unreal Engine and we're going to explore how simple or complex Previz can be. Now, one thing I wanna make clear is this episode is not really gonna get into the environment creation process. If you wanna see my workflow for how I go about creating environments, you can actually check out our previous episode where we recreated a shot from Alien Romulus in Unreal Engine 5. So before we get into all that, let's first define what Previz is. Previz is the collaborative process that generates preliminary versions of shots or sequences using a virtual environment. This technique has become increasingly popular over the years in film and TV shows, and now with programs like Unreal Engine, this is becoming more accessible to really any level of production. Even HBO's The Last of Us used Unreal Engine to previz several sequences in the show so that they could plan them out ahead of time. This now allows you to really visualize what your shot is going to look like before you even show up on set. And when we're talking about things like virtual production and ICVFX, that's kind of the name of the game. We want to know everything before we show up on set. Now, another term that is similar is TechViz, and this is defined as the use of 3D assets to perform technical analysis on scenes. Basically, this is where we're really getting into the weeds. We can now sit down and say, hey, what does this shot look like with a 35mm, or what does it look like with an 85mm? And you can start testing those things to really narrow down what you like. So now that we've defined what this is, I now want to hop over to Unreal Engine so that I can show you my Previz workflow. This right here is an environment I found in the marketplace. It is actually this right here, the 4-in-1 modular research facility bundle. So I found this hallway and it really gave me a lot of inspiration for how I could just compose this sequence. And what we're gonna do now is really get into how we set up cameras in Unreal Engine. And then after that, after we kind of go through cameras and sequencer, we'll then break down one of those shots from the opening cinematic. So we have our hallway here, and let's say we wanna start with maybe this kind of wide shot down the hallway. Well, what I like to do is take my viewport and move it wherever I want the camera to be. So let's say we want to be roughly like right here. That's a great spot. So if you come up here to these three lines and we hit create camera here and then CineCam actor, and it's going to place that camera right where you had your viewport. So first things first, we always want to label our camera just for organizational purposes. And this really should be labeled however the production is labeling their shot in the shot list. For demo purposes, we're going to call this scene 1 shot 1 cam. And this is how it's traditionally set up. It is a scene with shots inside of it. So scene 1, shot 1, scene 1, shot 2, and so on and so forth. And then I'm just going to create a cinematics folder where I've already created a scene 1 folder, and I'm going to place the scene 1, shot 1 camera in there, again, just for organizational purposes so I can find it later. And so now with our camera selected, we're going to look at some key settings. The first one I like to look at is the film back setting. This is going to affect the actual width and height of the sensor. Now you could use a preset that's right here, or if you already know what camera they're going to use on the production, you could look up the sensor width and height and put that in here so you can actually simulate how it's going to look through that camera. But for this demo, we're just going to choose the 16:9 DSLR preset, and then we're going to go down to the lens settings. And this is where you set things like the focal length. Now, since we're going with a wider shot, we want something like a 24 or 35mm. So right here, we can just dial it in. We're going to say 35mm and 35mm. And down below that, we have our focus settings, which is where we can dial in what we call our critical focus. In the real world or in the virtual world, you always want to make sure that the eye of your character is what's in focus. This is what we call the critical focus. And this is the setting where you can actually dial that in. Now, we're not going to do anything with this here yet until we get sequencer set up, because then we'll actually be able to really dial in where we want our focal plane to live. And lastly, I like to come down to the crop setting here, and this is where you can easily apply a 2:3:9 aspect ratio, which gives us that widescreen look. 2:3:9 is one of the most common aspect ratios that is used by film and television shows. And so that's the main camera settings, and you can see now we have a 35mm looking down this hallway, and now we're going to take this camera that we just created and bring it into a sequencer. So sequencer is literally a timeline where we can compose all of our shots. And to create one, you come up to this clapboard up here in the top left, and we're going to create add level sequence. Now I like to create a cinematics folder in my content browser, and we're just going to name this scene 1. And now you can name this however you want it to, but for this demo, we're going to call it scene 1 because this is where all of the shots for scene 1 are going to live. And we can hit save, and this is going to open a sequencer at the bottom of our screen. And this is literally just like a timeline you would see in an editing program. Now, the first thing I like to do is change my frame rate, which is right here, and we can change this to whatever frame rate we want our project to be. I like to put this at 23,976. This is the standard frame rate in North America for film and TV shows. And now we want to add our Cinecam actor, and there are 2 ways you could do this. You could drag it from the outliner straight into the sequencer, or you could hit add actor to sequence, and we can just type in shot 1. There's our camera. We just click it, and now it adds it to it. And a couple things happen here. So it adds our camera, but it also adds a camera cut track. This is the track where we can tell it what camera to cut to, because we're going to bring in all of the Cinecam actors that we create, but the camera cut track is when it's going to tell it when to cut to that camera. And so now we want to go about animating our camera here in Sequencer. Now the Cinecam actor comes with some components automatically, like your aperture, your focal length, your focus distance, but also all of your transforms like location, rotation, and scale. And you can keyframe these, which is exactly what we're going to do right now to animate that camera. So we're going to go under transform here. We're going to go under location. And you can see if I take the Y axis, this actually moves the camera forward and backward, just like a dolly move. So let's say we want to start a little bit further back, like right here, where we're kind of outside of these columns. Again, this is how we're dialing in the camera. And here's a pro tip. If you want to actually really dial in the composition of your shot, switch over to the cinematic viewport, then go to perspective and pilot the camera you're looking through. And now you get this new option to apply something like a grid. And this grid is super handy for being able to really get things centered up. So we can see, okay, I want to get this door nice and centered in this shot. So we're going to create a keyframe next to the Y axis under location that is under transform. This keyframe is going to tell it, hey, this is where the camera starts. Let's go forward. I want this shot to be about, let's say, 3 seconds. And we're going to move the camera forward a little bit, just like that. And now I'm going to make sure this keyframe is at the beginning. We're going to shorten this shot on the camera track to be 3 seconds long. So now if it goes past it, there is no shot for it to cut to. It's just going to go back out in the scene. And this is going to give us room to set up our second shot for it to cut to. So you can now see, if I scroll back and hit play, we've got this nice slow dolly move down the hallway. But you can see that it's got some easing applied to it, where it starts slow, speeds up, and then slows back down. And in my opinion, that is just not realistic of real world camera movement. What I like to do is take those keyframes, highlight them, right click and click linear. And now if you watch, it's just one constant speed for the movement. And this just feels much more realistic of like what a dolly move looks like in a movie. So now we've got our opening dolly shot. So let's create another camera that we can now cut to in this camera cut track. So I'm going to toggle out of the camera cut track, and I'm going to come and take our viewport somewhere like in this elevator. Let's say maybe we want to do something like an over the shoulder shot. So we're going to, again, click the 3 lines, create camera here, Cinecam actor. And I'm going to go through the same process and dial in the look of our lens. We're going to set this to a 50 millimeter and give it the 239 crop. And we are going to drag that right in here to the camera cut track to start right after that shot. So now if I toggle that track and we hit play, boom. Now we're looking over the shoulder. And now this is where I can actually pilot that camera. We're going to slow down the camera speed. This is that icon right up here. You can slow or speed up the camera speed. So now when I use the WASD keys, I can really dial in, like I want this to be kind of over the shoulder, like we're looking to see where the character is looking like down that hallway. But now the character is super out of focus. So this is where those focus settings are really going to come in handy. So let's move this up and let's look under camera component. We have our manual focus distance. And so now I can really pull this back to focus on our character, but let's make sure we're really hitting that critical focus. If I come over here to our focus settings and I click the draw debug focus plane, that's now going to show us this purple plane in our viewport here. And so I can drag this to really be right on the back of our character. But let's say we want to do something like a rack focus. It starts on the fire in the background and rack focuses to our character. This is the same method we just used for animating the camera. We're going to just keyframe and animate the focus. So let's keyframe here and let's keyframe here. And let's say we want to focus actually to the character. So we've already set that one up technically. So now we're going to focus all the way back to that fire back there. And it focuses from the hallway to our character. There you go. And now we've got a nice little rack focus from what our character sees back to our character. And one final thing we could do if we want to get a little extra with this is we could add a little bit of camera shake to this. Now, I'm not going to go into how to create a camera shake preset in Unreal because William Faucher over on YouTube has an incredible tutorial that covers all of this. I will link to that in the description below for how you can create your very own camera shake presets. But to apply those presets, all you got to do is come to the plus icon next to your camera and go to camera shake and just apply it. And it will now show as a little drop down that we want to make sure it is fully covering the shot. So you just want to drag it to where that camera shake preset covers the whole shot. And now we've got a little bit of a camera shake preset, like it's handheld, like someone's standing behind our character with that camera on something like a shoulder rig. But keeping things simple, let's add one more shot to this scene and we will actually move our character down the hallway to just give an example of what the character will be doing on the actual shoot. All right, so I've set up a very simple camera here, just using the same method we just covered, and this is now just dollying down the hallway. So we're gonna take our metahuman here that we already have placed into our scene, and we're gonna bring him into this sequencer from our outliner. So let's just drag him into the sequencer here. And so it's gonna open up the animation mode. We're not gonna get into that just yet. We're gonna switch back to our selection mode here. I'm gonna delete these control rigs out because we just don't need them for this very simple use of this metahuman. What I do want is to add a transform effect to it by clicking the plus next to the metahuman and go to transform. And now we can easily change the location of our metahuman. And now, again, guys, we're doing the same method of just adding some keyframes to have him simply sliding down this hallway. And there we go. Using the exact same methods we just went through on the other two shots, I have now just keyframed this camera to move down this hallway and have this metahuman just sliding down the hallway. And that's a really great example of just how quick you can put this together. I mean, we literally just created this little sequence of a guy sitting in an elevator, looking through the door, and then it cuts to a shot where he's now walking down the hallway. And it's that easy, guys. It takes a matter of minutes to put something like this together. And you could just stick with this and call it a day and move on because this is going to give you everything you need to know. But some directors might want to figure out, how are we blocking things? What is the character doing? How is the lighting going to look? And this is where you get into the more advanced territory. So let's take a look at that by breaking down one of the shots from my opening cinematic. So here's my sequence I set up for that opening cinematic. You can see as I scrub through the shots, we've got a lot going on here. We've got a lot of animated things, but really there's nothing out of the ordinary here of what we haven't already covered except for the metahuman. And the way I was able to animate this metahuman was using the metahuman control rig. Whenever you add a metahuman to sequencer, there's automatically a body control rig and a face control rig. And I used that body control rig to modify an animation I got from Mixamo. I was able to find this animation right here from Mixamo that was a simple walking with a rifle animation. And I knew that this would give me a great starting point because I could then offset the hands and arms to be in a different position because I wanted him to hold a handgun and a flashlight, not a two-handed rifle. Now, I won't really get into the weeds of importing Mixamo animations into Unreal just because there are 1,000 tutorials out there already. But one thing I want to highlight for you is the retargeting method in Unreal Engine 5.4 because it makes this whole thing so easy. Once you import your animation to Unreal, you should have this animation sequence automatically created with the Mixamo skeleton. And Unreal Engine 5.4 makes it so easy to retarget that animation to your metahuman. All you got to do is right-click on the animation sequence that you imported and click Retarget Animations. Then you want to apply it to the metahuman body, which you can find by going to your metahuman, opening up the blueprint, going to the body on the left side, and then over here on the right side, you see the skeletal mesh asset, which is the body we need to retarget it to. And you can click the magnifying glass to show it in the content browser, switch back to the retargeting window and click the arrow to automatically populate that body you just found. And then you just double click on the animation that you want to retarget it and bam, there you go. It's now retargeted to that metahuman. You click export animation and you choose where you want to save that animation. It is that simple. And I absolutely love this feature because before Unreal Engine 5.4, this was a little more in-depth and sometimes made you pull your hair out. So now that we've got our animation imported, we can then apply that animation to our metahuman, which you can see right here in our sequencer. I've applied the walking animation for this shot. And you can see there are multiple instances because it basically starts a new version of it when I cut to the next shot. Right? So each shot has its own lighting, has its own animation applied that I can really dial in. But of course, now we need to alter that animation because it's going to be holding its two hands in a certain position that's not going to work with our animation. So Again, we go to our control rig, and the number one thing you want to do is make sure your control rig for the body is set to layered, because if you don't have it set to layered and you bring in your Mixamo animation, nothing is going to happen because the control rig is going to override that animation. So if you come up here and just click convert to layered, it will now let you use the control rig on top of that Mixamo animation. And so when you click on your control rig, it automatically switches to the animation mode, and we can hit the G key to see this control rig in action. And now we have all these options for how we can alter our animation. We can raise the gun, we could turn his head to be looking left, right, wherever we want it to be. And this is exactly what I did for this sequence. I just went through and I started to alter, okay, the camera starts by looking at the gun, starts to dolly left, moving with him, and it slowly tilts up to our character as he hears these creepy sounds in this corridor. The control rig is a really great thing for dialing the movement of your character, and I'm going to leave you with two last bonus tips here. So one thing to be aware of is this icon right here. This is an icon that will automatically create a keyframe when you change something in the sequencer. Now, the flip side of that is to be aware when that icon is turned on, because you could accidentally create keyframes that you didn't want, and you might have to go back and fix those later. So just be aware that this icon right here will create automatic keyframes for you as you scrub through and make adjustments to things like a control rig. Now, the last bonus tip is how I was able to attach the handgun and the flashlights to the hands of the metahuman. The easy way to do this now is using what's called constraints. So if you click on the actor that you want to constrain to a part of your metahuman, come up here and make sure you're in the animation mode. You can switch to it right here. And right on this left pane here, you can see at the bottom, there's constraints. And we can tell it that we actually want this handgun to be constrained to a certain part of the metahuman. You can see this handgun is constrained to the left hand. Now I could actually change this. I could hit X and I could hit plus, hit parent, and I could parent it to a new part of the body. And this dropper pops up that actually tells you what item you're highlighting in your scene. You click on the metahuman, and now we want to tell it where it needs to be parented to. And in this case, we did body, and I'm going to type in hand, and this needed to be attached to the left hand. And now it follows wherever the hand goes. And then using the control rig, I was able to wrap the fingers around the gun so that it looked like he was holding it. And then I just rinsed and repeated the same method for the flashlight, parented it using a constraint, and then I just wrapped the fingers around it, and it really just followed the animation of the metahuman. And then at that point, all I had to do was animate the arm and the wrist of the metahuman to actually turn the flashlight wherever I wanted it to be looking. And so once you've got everything set and you're happy with how your characters are animated, your cameras are set up, your lighting looks, you can now then render this out. And there's a couple ways to render out of sequencer. Now, we're not going to really dive deep into all the render settings because there's a lot to it, but there are two methods for rendering out of sequencer. One is the legacy renderer, which if you click that and click the little clapper right here, it brings up a very simple box to then export out something like a PNG sequence, an AVI video, or even an MOV. There's lots of options here that you can tell it where you want to save it to and what resolution you want, what frame rate you want. Now, this is of course the old rendering method for Unreal Engine, but for Previz purposes, this one works great. We don't have to use things like ray tracing or path tracing or some of the more advanced settings for just a Previz. You could just render it with the old method and just call it a day. But just so you're aware, there is another method. If you click the three dots next to the clapperboard, you could switch to the movie render queue. And this is where you get into the more advanced side of rendering in Unreal Engine. You can apply things like anti-aliasing, color profiles, console variables for upping certain parameters, like better motion blur to better depth of field. But this comes at the cost of time, because as you start to add things like anti-aliasing and samples, it's going to take much, much longer. I actually did a render of this whole sequence using the movie render queue and all of the advanced settings, and it took 2 days to render. And that's a long time. And it's kind of a pain in the butt when you have to go re-render something. If there was a frame that got messed up or a whole shot needed to be re-rendered because the lighting was wrong. And it's like this whole give and take of time and budget, and something to just be aware of, because when it comes to Previz, it doesn't need to be that polished. You could just use the old render method. It renders almost in real time, and it's going to get you a much quicker result. So I really just wanted y'all to be aware of the ways to render out of Unreal Engine, but that's not really what this tutorial is about. And if you do want to learn more about that, just go on YouTube and look up movie render queue tutorials for Unreal Engine 5. Now, obviously we could take this a whole lot further and go really more in depth, but I wanted this video to act as a really good primer to introducing you to all the things available to you when it comes to creating Previz or even cinematics in Unreal Engine. Now, if you're wanting to dive deeper and really get into the weeds on how I go about lighting my scenes, how I light my characters, how I compose my shots, I've actually started to work on a course that acts as an introduction to creating cinematics in Unreal Engine. And this covers everything from advanced camera techniques to lighting your scenes and also, more importantly, lighting your characters, because there are real world principles that I apply in my lighting that make a huge difference in making your renders stand out and feel more photoreal and cinematic. So if that's something that interests you, then let me know by leaving a comment down below, because I'd love to gauge the interest in something like this and really get feedback from you guys to make sure this is a course that's really worth your time and your money. So my plan is to pre-record the course and sell it on a site like Artlist or Gumroad or something similar. So be on the lookout for that in the future. And that is it for today, guys. Thank you so much for checking out the video. If you learned anything, if you took anything away of value, be sure to like the video and subscribe, because we have a lot more content like this coming in the future. And if you haven't already, we do have a Discord channel that you can join. This is a place where you can go and surround yourself with other people in the virtual production community. And of course, I'm David Stapp with Virtual Production Insider, and we'll see you next time.